The whistle of the train still screamed in my ears when I dropped to the planks of the station. Steam curled around me like ghostly fingers, and the crowd scattered into the dust. But I saw none of them, my eyes fixed on the tiny pair of shoes lying where my daughter had fallen, Elowen Grace. One moment her hand was in mine, the next, only this. I clutched those shoes as if they might still carry her heartbeat. The station boards were hot, the sun sharp, and yet a chill ran through me deeper than any winter. The town doctor knelt once, shook his head, and whispered the words no father should hear. "She's gone, Silas." But then I heard her. Not a word, not even a breath. More like the faintest murmur trapped between wood and air. My chest tightened. No one else turned, no one reacted. They looked at me with pity, as if grief had made me hear ghosts. But I know the sound of my child. And in that moment, I swore Elowen was not gone, and someone else believed it too. He stood apart from the crowd, watching, his shadow cut through the steam, his braids hanging loose over his shoulders, his chest draped with a pouch of bone and feather. A Choctaw healer whispered about, more than welcomed. Mothers clutched their children tighter when his name was spoken. The ministers cursed him from pulpits. Yet the old ones admitted, quietly, that he had done things no doctor dared claim. Our eyes met across the station. He did not look away. The townsfolk parted when he walked forward, as if the very air bent around him. His boots struck the boards with steady rhythm, each step louder than the train itself. He crouched not by the doctor, not by me, but by the place where Elowen had collapsed, his hand pressed flat to the wood, as though listening to the earth beneath us. "She isn't gone," he said. The words tore through me. I stared at him, unable to breathe. Hope is cruel when death has already stepped into your life. "What did you say?" I managed. He tilted his head, still listening to something I could not hear. "She lingers between breath and shadow, but if you leave her here, the shadow will claim her." Behind us, someone spat on the ground. "Blasphemy!" Another woman hissed, dragging her children away. But I could not move. My heart pounded harder than the wheels of the departing train. Doctors Barry. This man claimed he could bring back. The shoes slipped from my hands, landing on the planks with a hollow knock. They rocked once, then stilled, facing me as if waiting for Elowen's feet to fill them again. My throat closed. The crowd gasped, murmuring about tricks and madness, but none of them dared touch the shoes. The healer rose slowly. His shadow stretched long across the platform, darker than the smoke. He leaned near, and I caught the scent of sage and fire clinging to his skin. His eyes held no comfort, only certainty. "If you want her back, Silas Crowther," he murmured, "follow me before the sun sets, or prepare to bury more. Then a child." The words cut deeper than any knife. My faith told me to turn away. The doctor's verdict told me to grieve. But my blood, my soul, everything in me screamed that I could not leave my daughter to shadows. The healer turned, walking into the dusk beyond the station, leaving me with the shoes still warm in my trembling hands. I stared after him, torn between salvation and damnation, between a grave and a promise. And in that moment, one thought seized me, sharper than grief, heavier than hope. If he was right, what would Elowen come back as? And worse, what price would I pay? The doctor's hand gripped my arm as I moved to follow the healer, his fingers strong and urgent, like a man holding another back from a precipice. His eyes were steady and full of the authority that came with years of tending to the sick and burying the dead. And he spoke with a finality that cut like a blade. "Silas, you've lost her. Don't damn yourself chasing lies." His words carried the weight of reason, of science, of everything a sensible man ought to accept. For the briefest moment, I nearly let him anchor me there on that platform, a grieving father with nothing left but a pair of shoes and a memory. But then, beneath the hiss of steam and the shuffle of restless feet, I heard it again. A sound so fragile it might have been mistaken for the settling of wood, yet it ran like lightning through my chest. It was not speech, not even breath, but a flutter, faint as a bird's wings against glass. I knew the sound of my daughter, and this was no phantom born of grief. My chest tightened, my throat closed, and every fiber of me screamed the truth. Elowen was not gone. Takoda Blackthorn stood at the edge of the crowd, his shadow stretched long across the station boards, his presence both feared and avoided. He did not need to speak to command space. The air around him already trembled with unease. Mothers pulled their children closer, men turned their eyes away, yet no one dared confront him. The weight of his silence was heavier than their condemnation. When our gazes locked, I felt exposed, as if he had already looked through me and found the part of me that refused to surrender. He knew I had heard what no one else had. When I reached him, he did not ask what I believed. Belief had already claimed me. He leaned close, his voice low and unyielding, and said, "Her body remains, but her spirit drifts. If you do nothing, the shadow will take her before dawn." His words carried no doubt, no hesitation, only a certainty that frightened me more than the doctor's verdict. My lips trembled as I asked, "And if I follow you?" He did not smile, nor soften. "Then she may return, but not without cost." The word hung in the air like a tolling bell, heavier than the coal smoke that drifted across the station. I thought of my ranch, the herds I had fought storms to protect, the land carved from stone and sweat. I thought of my wife, buried years before, the promise I had made to raise Elowen with both her share of love and mine. What more could life strip from me? What cost could be greater than what I had already lost? Yet when I turned and looked back at the platform where she had fallen, all I saw was emptiness, an absence deeper than any grave, and I knew at once that I would give anything to fill it, anything. The crowd was not finished with me. A preacher, face crimson with fervor, raised his Bible and shouted for all to hear, "Silas Crowther, that man traffics in shadows. You would invite demons into your house for the sake of false hope." His words spread like wildfire. Gasps rippled through the crowd, prayers muttered in trembling voices, children shielded behind mothers' skirts. The word demon struck like a brand, scorching my conscience, reminding me of the faith I had carried all my life. To follow this man would mean stepping beyond the boundaries of the righteous, would mean turning to the forbidden in defiance of everything I had been taught. For a moment, shame clawed at me. I felt their eyes burning into my back, their whispers coiling like snakes around my name. But then my gaze fell once more upon Elowen's shoes, resting where she had slipped from life. They rocked gently, as though moved by breath, and shame became weightless compared to the thought of leaving her to darkness. Faith could condemn me, neighbors could curse me, but no word, no sermon, could bind my heart to silence when my daughter still lingered between this world and the next. I turned from the preacher, his voice still railing behind me, and walked toward Takoda. The healer did not gloat or smile in triumph. He merely inclined his head as if this choice had been carved into fate long before tonight. "Bring her shoes," he said quietly, "when we will need them." The word sent a chill through me. "For what?" I asked, my voice trembling. His gaze never wavered, deep and unblinking. "For her return." The horizon was aflame with the last light of the sun as we stepped beyond the station. Shadows stretched long over the plains, and the silence of the land pressed against us like a held breath. I carried Elowen's shoes close, as though they might vanish like she had, each step pulling me further from the world I knew, and deeper into one I feared. Behind me, the preacher's shouts faded into nothing, swallowed by the vast night. Ahead, the healer moved with a purpose that was both terrifying and undeniable, as if he had walked this path 100 times before. When we reached the edge of the town, Takoda stopped and turned, his figure carved against the dim glow of the dying sun. His voice carried not threat but certainty. "Before the sun rises, you will face a choice. If you falter, she will be lost, not only to you, but to this world." I opened my mouth to ask what he meant, but his hand lifted, silencing me. "Not yet," he said. "Some truths must wait." And so we walked into the dark, beyond the station lights, into a silence where even the night seemed to hold its breath. I did not know if I walked toward salvation or damnation. I only knew this. If Takoda was right, my daughter lingered between breath and shadow, and whatever it took, I would bring her back. Yet even as I swore it, a darker question rose inside me, heavier than hope, sharper than fear. If Elowen returned, what would she return as? And worse still, what price would I be forced to pay? We left the last lamplight of town behind us and stepped into a prairie that breathed like a living thing, the grass sighing in long waves as the wind pulled at it, the sky stretched black and deep enough to swallow a man whole, and though my boots were sure on the earth, I felt the ground tilt with every step, as if the world itself were warning me back. Beside me, Takoda Blackthorn moved with the quiet certainty of a hunter who had already decided where the trail would end, and I realized I had not once seen him look down to place his feet, as though some older sense guided him. I asked where we were going, and he said only that Elowen would not be found in the places where men stacked rules on top of fear, and that the border between breath and shadow ran out here where the night had room to open its mouth. I wanted to ask what that meant, but the wind carried a smell of sage and rain that did not yet exist, and before I could shape another word, he lifted a finger to the darkness and I heard it. Something soft as silk tearing, a sound from no throat I knew, and no animal I had ever tracked, the barest suggestion of a voice curling through the grass, as if the night were learning how to speak my child's name. For a heartbeat, I nearly turned back, because terror in daylight wears a face a man can strike, but terror in an empty field has no edge to grasp, only the knowledge that you are too small for what is listening. Takoda watched me in that flicker of doubt and said the plains are never empty, only misheard, that every mercy and every cruelty keeps a ledger. And then he asked if I had ever bargained with the weather or with a dying horse. And I said, you don't bargain. You stand your ground and you pay what's owed. At this he nodded, not pleased, not mocking, simply filing away the shape of the man he had chosen to lead. And he told me the ledger tonight would not be written in coin. The word ledger scraped at something inside me and a memory I had kept buried. How my wife's breath turned to ice the winter Elowen came. How I had knelt at a different bedside and promised the silence anything if it would leave me one of them. Rose up with a taste like iron. I swallowed it down and walked. We reached a low stand of cottonwoods along a dry creek where the winds braided themselves into a murmur, and Takoda stopped at the split trunk of an old tree, resting his palm against the scar as if greeting an elder who had outlived its name. He told me every place remembers its dead, and some places remember how to refuse them, and when I asked which kind this was, he said that would depend on what I carried in my mouth, not in my hands. He drew a small bundle from his pouch and unwrapped it. A length of red thread, a pinch of gray ash, a feather so black it swallowed the starlight. He held each in turn to the air as though confirming they still belonged to this world. And then he asked for Elowen's shoes. I had not realized how fiercely I had been holding them until my fingers ached with the letting go, and when he set the shoes on the roots, heels touching, toes parted like a door left ajar, I felt a shift in the air so subtle I might have missed it, if not for the way the hair rose along my forearms, as if the night had leaned closer to see what we were brave or foolish enough to do next. He said the doctor would call him a liar, because the doctor believed the body was a house with only one door, but his people knew a body could be a doorway in a guest room, and a trap all at once, and that sometimes the soul, frightened by pain or pulled by grief, wandered out into the yard without knowing how to come back in. I told him my faith taught that the Maker alone rehearsed the comings and goings, and he answered that he had seen men die with a prayer half spoken and return when no one expected, and he had seen men prayed over until the benches cracked, and still the light in them would not take root. So perhaps the Maker listened better when men stopped shouting and let the land speak. I wanted to argue, if only to keep fear at bay with the sound of my own voice, But another thread of that silk tearing drifted past, closer this time, and I felt something brush the inside of my chest like a moth trapped behind my ribs, and whatever argument I had withered on my tongue. Takoda bound the shoes together with the red thread and dusted the leather with ash, his hands moving with an economy that felt like reverence. Then he set the black feather across the small bridge of laces so that it pointed toward me. He told me to place my right hand over the feather and to speak my daughter's name the way I would have spoken it if I had been the one dying and needed her to find me in the smoke of a burning barn. The image struck so hard my throat closed because I could smell it. The old barn timber, the sweet rot of hay, the sear of pitch. And when I said Elowen, the name broke in the center as if the barn beam gave way in my mouth. The grass bent toward us, though no wind moved, and the feather lifted, not by my hand, but by a draft drawn up from the seam between roots. And when it settled again, the shoes had inched a hair closer to one another. I didn't breathe because to move was to admit that what I had just seen belonged to the world of seeing rather than the wish of it. And in that held breath, I realized how far from town I had traveled, not in miles, but in permission. He asked what I had promised the night my Auror's wife died, and I told him promises, spoken over the dying, were private coin between a man and his God. He said this was true when a man kept them, and untrue when a man did not, and the force of that simple judgment felt like a door I had braced finally giving. I confessed I had begged to keep the child, even if it meant losing the mother, that I had offered my years, my land, my pride, anything that would keep a scrap of her living in our house. And when the silence took my wife and left my daughter, I had told myself bargains made in grief were not binding because the Lord did not haggle with fools. Takoda listened without triumph, without pity, and when I finished, he said the plains keep their own contracts, and some are written in breath, and some in names, and some in the footpaths of children. Then he looked past me into the trees and asked, in a voice that made the night hold still, if I was prepared to pay a balance I had set in motion before I understood arithmetic. I wanted to tell him I would pay anything, but the word anything is a bright lie men use when they cannot imagine the invoice. What came out instead was the truth. If Elowen returns, I will give what is mine to give, and if what is required is not mine, teach me how to take it. He nodded once, and the nod felt like the world slipping onto a track that had always been there, waiting for my weight. He placed the feather finally between the shoes, not across, but pointing through, and the air drew tight. And somewhere under the roots, the dry creek ticked like a clock you only notice when the room is otherwise silent. He told me we would light no fire here because fire speaks too loudly for a first conversation, and that the rest of what must be done would be set under flames where both mercy and cruelty could see our faces. And when I asked when, he said, before the sun has the chance to decide for us. He gathered the thread and the ash and returned the shoes to my hands, and their leather felt warmer than the night should have allowed. As we stepped from the cottonwoods, a shape moved at the edge of seeing, the kind of movement you dismiss because your mind wants corridors, and this country has none, and I knew without knowing that we were no longer walking alone. Takoda did not look back, but he spoke as if to the thing beside us and said the path would hold if the father remembered the price he had named and the mouth he had spoken it with, and the answering quiet was so complete I understood the difference between silence and listening. Ahead, the prairie dipped toward a darker seam where the land gathered itself, and a faint band of firelight trembled against the horizon like a heartbeat learning a new rhythm. Takoda said we would make our stand there, and that the bargain would ask me for something I had not yet allowed myself to love. I tightened my grip on Elowen's shoes until the stitching bit my palm, and I tasted the penny flavor of fear as if blood had risen to meet the night. I told myself a father is a ledger too, and that I could pay whatever numbers were set in front of me. But the truth pressed its forehead to mine and would not move. If the plains remembered my promise, then memory would have its due, and the due might not be mine to choose. We walked toward the fire that waited. I said my daughter's name once more to keep it warm in my mouth, and the wind returned the sound, to me altered by distance, not less but other, as if a second throat had learned it. We were almost to the light when Takoda spoke without turning, saying that once a door is opened, it must be closed by the same hand. And I thought of the shoes pointed like a doorway and the feather pointing through. And I asked what would step across if Elowen followed my voice back into this world. Takoda answered that doors do not choose travelers, only terms, and before I could, Takoda's fire lived at the ragged edge of town where the prairie shouldered up against a low cut of rock, its glow beating a narrow circle into the dark, as if it were the heart of something buried and still determined to live. I followed him down a slope of shale and scrub until the heat reached my face, and the air shifted from the smell of cold grass to the bitter, resinous breath of burning sage. He had arranged the place with a discipline that made me think of altar rails and branding pens in the same breath, stones stacked with the care of a patient mason, bundles of herbs tied with red thread, a small rack of bones that rattled in the wind like a wind chime, built from someone's forgotten family. I wanted to say that none of this could matter, that a man could not build a ladder from smoke, but the fire spoke louder than my doubt, cracking in a language that sounded too close to words to ignore. He gestured for me to sit opposite him, the blaze between us, and when I settled onto the ground, the heat climbed into my ribs and set its fingers there, as if checking whether the engine of my life still turned. He sang. No hymn I knew, no tune I could follow, a river of syllables that ran under my feet and seemed to move the dirt a fraction closer to the sky. I had heard men chant in war drunkenness, and I had heard preachers pound the pulpit until their voices broke. But this was neither. It was quieter, truer, a sound meant for the kind of listening that happens when everything else has left the room. And then, beneath his voice, I heard the low drum he kept concealed in his lap, its skin struck with the heel of his hand, a heartbeat teaching the night to remember it had one. The fire threw shadows like long, reaching hands across the red earth, and in those hands Takoda set out his tools, a bowl rubbed black with ash, a twist of tobacco, a fan of feathers so dark they seemed to eat the light that touched them, a cord of plaited hair bound at one end with copper wire. The sight of that cord prickled my scalp as if my own hair had been touched. I felt the old catechism, rising in me, the measured words of childhood Sundays, suffer us not to fall into temptation. And then the memory of the preacher at the station roared back, his Bible a hammer, his voice swollen with the promise of damnation. Between that hammer and this fire, I sat with my daughter's shoes in my lap, and the weight of them felt heavier than any book of law. Takoda's chant faded to a hum. He fixed me with a gaze that did not pretend gentleness and said, in plain English that cut clean as wire, "Before we call, you must speak. The door will not answer to a mouth that lies." The phrasing made me swallow, because I had spent the afternoon telling myself I was a good man with a hard fate, and here he was asking for a ledger, not a poem. "What door?" I asked, buying time with my ignorance. He touched the ground, the firelight gold on his knuckles. "The one between breath and shadow. It opens to truth. It closes on shame." The fire popped and tossed a curl of sparks toward the stars. I stared into it and saw the boiler of a train swallowing coal, saw my wife's eyes when the fever climbed, saw Elowen's first cry, small as a moth caught in the throat of night. My voice scraped when I asked what he needed to hear. He did not hesitate. "Tell me about the moment she came into this world," he said, and then softer, "Tell me what you asked for to keep her here." I had not told anyone, not the neighbor woman who sat through the labor with me, not the preacher who buried my wife in ground that froze the spade to my fingers, not the wind that howled on the ridge the night I took Elowen home, wrapped in a coat too big for both of us. The secret had lived under my tongue like a sliver, and I had learned to speak around it. But the drum kept time with my pulse, and the smell of sage folded the past over the present until I could not tell which night I was in. And then I felt the weight of my wife's hand in mine again, remembered the way she squeezed once and never again. The words came. "I asked to keep the child," I said. "I told the dark it could take me, take the cattle, take the roof from the house, take everything that wore my name, if it would leave her breathing." I asked it to choose between us, and it did. I told myself later it was not a bargain, only the noise a man makes when the floor drops away. But the noise has followed me, and the floor has never stopped moving. The bones on the rack clicked as the wind turned, a small, polite acknowledgement from whatever listened beyond the circle of light. Takoda stared through the fire, as if reading a line etched there, then nodded once, the grave nod of a man receiving bad news that matches his expectations. Debt, he said, almost kindly. Not sin. A balance owed. I bristled, because the words felt lighter than the weight they named. My wife died while I begged, I said. How does a balance survive that? He drew smoke from the twist of tobacco and let it curl around his tongue before it escaped. Some promises do not end at the grave, he said. They grow teeth there. He reached across the fire and held out his palm. Give me her shoes. The leather left my hands as if reluctant to be parted, and he set them side by side on the warm earth, heels kissing, toes pointed toward the dark beyond the fire's edge. Ritual needs simple geometry. Even a skeptic knows that. He bound the shoes softly with the plaited cord, the copper wire flashing, then dressed them with ash that dulled their shine and turned them into artifacts from a world that had never learned light. He whispered in the old tongue. No show, no flourish, a craftsman assembling the only bridge he knew how to build. Speak her name, he said. Say it like a man at the bottom of a well who can see the sky but not the rope. Elowen, I said, and the name scraped its knees on the way out. The drum deepened. The flames leaned as if blown by breath from beneath, though no wind touched my face. I felt the heat slick against my skin, and for an instant I smelled lilacs. Impossible in this stony place. And yet there it was, the exact ghost of the flowers she had tucked behind her ear at the station. My heart rode up into my throat so fast I thought I would choke on it. And then the shoes shifted. Not much. The width of a fingernail, but enough to turn the copper glint toward me like an eye-opening. I flinched. I nearly reached for them. Takoda's hand lifted. Do not touch, he said. And the authority in those 3 words froze me harder than winter. He laid the feather across the bound laces, pointing toward the gap beyond the firelight, and hummed low, a sound that made the earth under me feel less like a floor and more like a skin. He did not look away from the shoes when he asked, Whose name stood before yours when you carried her to the preacher on the paper? Heat that wasn't the fire ran through me. Hers, I said. Her mother's. Mary. I wrote it first. And in your heart? He asked. I closed my eyes, and the truth came soft as a knife. The child's, I said. I loved the child first. Takoda exhaled as if a second tally had clicked into place. He pinched ash between finger and thumb and let it fall, a snow that did not melt. The land heard you, he said. The night heard you. They are old clerks. They do not forget signatures. Then he leaned back, the drum went quiet, and the fire found its steady voice again. Now you know what you carry, he said. Now it will answer when we call. I wanted comfort or condemnation, anything that could be measured with the tools I had. He offered neither. He lifted a small gourd of water, poured a circle just beyond the fire where the light thinned, and the water sank as if thirsty ground had been waiting for a drink from that exact mouth. He stood, joints whispering, and the bones on the rack fell still as if the room had noticed the judge had entered. Listen to me, Silas Crowther, he said, not loudly, and the night listened because he had asked it to. We will call her. We will tie breath to breath and teach her feet to find the earth again. But hear this. The door does not swing for one traveler without opening to their shadow. If she returns, the feather quivered as if the sentence itself had weight. She will not return alone. The fire cracked. The darkness beyond it leaned in. I felt the words settle into me like iron hammered hot. And then, somewhere out past the ring of light, something answered with the smallest sound a living thing can make. The first drumbeat landed like distant thunder crawling over the plains. a low roll that shook loose grains of dirt from the stones and set them ticking, and with it the smoke thickened into ropes that climbed and braided themselves above the fire, as if they were learning to be a spine. Takoda's chant rose to meet the sound, not louder but closer, a voice that seemed to walk around me in slow circles, measuring my breath, my fear, my willingness to stand my ground when the ground itself might begin to move. He set Elowen's bound shoes at the edge of the poured circle, the copper glint of the wire catching and throwing back the light like a small, stubborn star. And he told me to keep my eyes on that star, no matter what else tried to take them. I said I would. I wanted to believe I could. And then the night shifted. It was not wind. It was not animal. It was the sensation of a room that had been empty, remembering who used to sit there. The hair along my arms lifted. The skin between my shoulder blades drew tight as if hands had pressed there, coaxing me toward the edge. Takoda's drumbeat settled into a pattern that matched the rhythm of the trains I had ridden as a boy, a cadence that said we are moving whether you feel it or not. And the smell of sage mingled with something sweeter, something I had known from a distance of years. Lilacs after rain, so clean it hurt. I felt my jaw tremble. I tasted copper. "Don't speak," he said without looking at me. "Not yet." He tipped ash into the bowl and breathed across it, and the ash did not scatter. It rose in a single soft column, as if the bowl had become a throat. He lifted the feather, held it over the bowl, and whispered in words that had edges I could not find. The smoke climbed through the feather's veins and carried a shadow of it upward, so that for a heartbeat I saw 2 feathers, one in his fingers, one drawn in smoke in the air above his hand. He lowered the real feather onto the laces and set the bowl between the shoes. "Call her," he said, "but call her like a father calling a child out of a river." "Elowen," I said, and the name struck something hollow in the dark and came back to me changed. The drum answered. The smoke answered. The ground under my knees answered with a tremor so fine I could have lied about it, if lying had any. I called again. "Elowen." The feather twitched as if a breath had stumbled again. The copper wire brightened, dimmed, brightened again. The temperature of the night climbed. Sweat ran up and stung my eye from the fire. Promised. But in the corner of my sight, where the dark met the darker, something like a ripple moved, and with it came a sound I had known since the first hour of my fatherhood. My child's thin cry, the first one, the one that had changed the shape of every word I spoke after. It threaded through the chant and the drum and upward through the smoke, and for a sliver of a moment I broke. My hands reached, my body rose. I would have run into the dark bareheaded if Takoda's voice had not struck me like a thrown rope. "Do not move," he said. "If you touch what is not yet named, it will wear the name you feared." I fell back to my knees. I gripped the earth. The drumbeat quickened, then held, then quickened. A horse driven to a steeper grade. Takoda's chant slipped its pattern and then found a deeper one, a subterranean road. He drew a knife from his belt, a narrow blade with a bone handle, and nicked his thumb so a single drop of blood spread and shone like lacquer. He touched that drop to the copper wire. It vanished as if the metal had drunk it. The scent changed. Iron and smoke, rain and lilac, all of it laced with something animal at the center, the kind of musk that rides the air when a calf stands on its legs for the first time. The leather of the shoes warmed to a color close to living skin. "Elowen," I said, and the shoes shuddered. It was small, no more than the breath a sleeper takes when a dream turns. Yet it moved through me like a spear. I wanted to shout, to laugh, to sob into the dirt. Instead, I pressed my palm flat and felt the thud of the drum travel through soil and flesh until I could not tell which beat belonged to the instrument and which to my own heart. And then, over the drum, over the chant, came a second voice. It was mine and not mine, my daughter's and not my daughter's, speaking in a cadence that did not belong to English or to any prayer I had ever heard, a child's pitch carrying a woman's gravity. The words crawled over my skin and left it colder where they passed. Takoda did not stop. He did not look up. He chose the beat he needed and kept it. "You must decide," he said, "whether you will trust the shape of the road when the mileposts are not yours." I did not answer, because my mouth had become a dry well. The smoke above the bowl thickened until the stars beyond it smudged. Within that column, images flickered. The white wall of the station, the glint of rails, the black doorway of a train car. I saw myself kneeling. I saw the shoes alone. I saw a child's hand leaving mine, not pulled, not pushed, drifting. The heat broke. Cold rushed in so fast my teeth knocked. The drum fell silent on a beat that left my body hanging between steps. In that instant, the night opened its hand and showed me what it held. Elowen, or the outline of her, suspended at the edge of the circle as if the air were a pond and she had been dropped into it without a splash. Her hair lifted in a wind that did not touch me. Her dress stirred as though someone had just stepped past. Her face, oh God, her face was turned toward the shoes, and in the shifting light it was my wife's face, and it was not. My mother's face, and it was not. My own face as a boy, and it was not. Silas, Takoda said, and my name sounded like a tool laid in a craftsman's palm. If you stop this now, she will wander. If you finish it, she will walk. I tasted the truth of both outcomes, metallic and undeniable. My hands shook. My faith crowded my throat, 100 Sundays arguing in a single roar. My love for my child drowned them all. Finish, I said. The word left me like a thrown nail. Takoda drove the drumstick down once, twice, 3 times, each strike a summons that knew exactly where it was aimed. The smoke coiled around the outline at the edge of the circle and drew her forward an inch, another inch. The copper wire shone and held. The feather lifted on a breath that did not come from me. I heard a cry, hers, and for a terrible instant it was not Elowen's voice at all, but a chorus of voices, layered through years I had not lived, women and children and men whose names I did not know, calling out across the same seam and asking the same price. The skin on my arms pebbled. My stomach turned to sand. Now, Takoda said. The feather dipped and pointed like a compass. The shoes jolted as if struck by a small, precise lightning. The bowl cracked with a sound like ice splitting on a river. Heat and cold collided and knocked the breath from me. I reached without thinking, grabbed the air where her hand should be, and felt resistance. The first real thing in hours that wasn't fire or dirt or fear. It was a hand, but it was not. It was the pressure of arrival. Light ran up through the smoke like oil catching flame, and in that flare, her eyes opened. They did not find me first. They found the fire, and in their pale, impossible glow, the flames leaned toward her as if greeting something older than themselves. Her eyes opened in the firelight, and for an instant, every ache in my chest broke loose in relief. I had prayed for breath, for a flicker of life, for anything that would mean I had not lost her forever, and here she was, looking back at me. But that relief froze the moment I truly saw them. Elowen's eyes had always been clear, soft gray like morning mist over the river. What stared at me now burned pale, bright as a storm cloud lit from within, the pupils drowning in light that did not belong to a child. I whispered her name, my voice raw from calling it through smoke and fear. Elowen! Her head turned toward me, her lips parted. But the sound that spilled out was not hers. It was low, rhythmic, a cadence too deliberate for a child, too ancient for a girl of 9. The language meant nothing to my ears, yet it pressed against me like a hand. Takoda's chant faltered for the first time, his eyes narrowing as if he had expected this but dreaded my hearing it. And then she laughed. It was not the tinkling laugh of a girl at play. It was deep, rising from her chest, with the weight of years she could not have lived. That sound hollowed me out. I wanted to run to her, to gather her in my arms, to convince myself she was only shaken, dazed, waking from a dream. But my feet held to the dirt as if the ground itself had shackled me. Something inside me whispered that to touch her now was to embrace not only my daughter, but what had come with her. Takoda stepped forward, his voice a sharp cut against the drum's fading echo. Do not move, Silas! The shadow clings! His words tore through me. I spun on him, desperate, furious. You said she would return! You said she was mine to call back!" He did not flinch. His gaze stayed on Elowen, who now stood in the circle of firelight, swaying slightly as though listening to music none of us could hear. "She has returned," he said, "but every door opens two ways. What passes through does not always return alone." The firelight bent strangely around her. When she turned her head, her hair lifted, as if stirred by a wind that touched nothing else. Her small hands curled and uncurled, but the movement felt practiced, rehearsed, like the gestures of an adult caught in a child's skin. My throat burned with a scream I could not release. I wanted to believe she was only weak from the ritual, only struggling to find her voice. But when she looked back at me, her lips shaped a word. It was my name. Not father, not papa, not the title she had known all her life. It was Silas, spoken with the gravity of an equal, not the innocence of a child. And worse, her tongue gave it an accent I had never heard in my own house. The sound of it set every hair on my neck upright. Takoda lowered the drum. He spoke softly, though every word cut like glass. "The spirit is bound. She breathes again because you would not let her go. But she is no longer alone in that skin." My chest heaved. I sank to my knees. "Then fix it," I begged. "Send it back. Cast it out. Give me my daughter whole." He shook his head slowly. "The price was written long before tonight. You cannot untie what you knotted with your grief. She may yet walk in her own steps again, but the shadow will follow until it finds where it belongs." Elowen, my Elowen, shifted her gaze toward the darkness beyond the fire. Her lips moved once more, murmuring words that rattled like stones rolling together in a dry riverbed. Then, without warning, she stepped across the ash line Takoda had drawn. The fire hissed as she passed, as though offended. I surged forward, ready to grab her, but Takoda caught my arm with a grip like iron. "If you touch her now, you will carry it too." My breath tore ragged in my throat. "She's my daughter." "She is more than that now," he said. Elowen's bare feet pressed into the dirt, leaving faint prints that glowed faintly in the firelight before fading. She did not look back. She walked with eerie calm, the gait not of a frightened child, but of someone who knew where the road already led. My stomach turned as I realized the direction she faced. Back toward the station, back to the place where she had fallen, where her shoes had been left behind like an offering. The drums were silent. The fire cracked low, its strength waning as though drained by what it had given. The only sound was the whisper of her voice, a language I could not name, spilling into the night as she drifted away from us. I tore against Takoda's grip, but he held me, his words hot against my ear. "Let her walk. If she chooses the station, it is because something waits for her there. Chase her now, and you will not know which one you bring back." The darkness swallowed her small figure step by step, her outline shrinking, the glow of her eyes the last thing visible before even that slipped away into the night. My knees buckled. My heart pounded with a terror I had never known. Worse than storms, worse than cattle raids, worse than the day I buried my wife. She was alive, but she was not mine. And as the night closed its mouth around her, one question cut deeper than all the rest. If I followed her into the shadows, would I be chasing my daughter, or something wearing her skin? We let the fire die to a red hush, the last tongues of flame licking the stones like tired animals. And when Takoda finally released my arm, the night was a single unbroken pane of black glass between us and the direction my daughter had taken. I did not wait for permission because permission had nothing left to offer me, and I set out along the faint seam her feet had pressed into the dust, the prints so light they seemed a suggestion more than a fact, each one blooming under starlight and then fading as if the earth were embarrassed to show what it had accepted. Takoda walked a pace behind, the weight of his silence making the prairie feel narrower than it was. And though he didn't touch me, I felt the tether of his presence like a rope laid across my shoulders. The air cooled, the scent of sage thinned. And the nearer we came to the edge of town, the more the world remembered its old shapes. Wooden fences ghosting up from the dark, the distant squared angles of roofs, the line of the tracks drawing a hard mouth through the land. Somewhere ahead, too soft to point to, a rhythm began to gather. Not drum, not wind, but the memory of iron moving over iron, the kind of pulse that rides through bone before it dares the ear. I had always thought the station belonged to daylight, to the business of departures and receipts, to the human noise of luggage and orders and men deciding their futures out loud. But in darkness it revealed a different ownership. The building hunched like a watchman who'd outlived his orders. The platform boards shone with a thin skin of frost that had no business forming in late summer, and the rails carried a smear of starfire as if they had learned to drink the sky. I slowed without meaning to because something in the silence had teeth, and Takoda's hand hovered near my shoulder, though it did not land. He breathed one word, "Listen," and I did. And it was then I heard the softest scrape, the sound a child might make if she dragged the side of her foot along wood to test whether the world would answer. My throat closed around her name. I did not call it. The station would have taken it from me and given it back changed. We stepped onto the boards, and the timber answered with a long, hollow note, a reminder that everything here was nailed together above a space that waited patiently to swallow sound. The whistle I feared did not come. Yet a pale steam moved under the platform as if some sleeping animal beneath had started to dream. I looked for Elowen, the way a man scans a river for the first gleam of a drowning hand, sideways, wide-eyed, allowing for the lie water tells. And what I found first was not my child, but a glimmer where no light should be, a silver stripe fluttering at ankle height near the far end of the platform. When I reached it, I saw that the stripe was the edge of a shoelace. A twin to one I had tied 100 hurried mornings with my teeth clenched around a pencil and a coffee gone cold. The lace led to leather, and the leather led to a pair of shoes, so like Elowen's that for an instant the world lost its grip and I felt my knees threaten the floorboards. They were clean where hers were scuffed, untouched by dust, set with the same deliberate geometry heel to heel, toes parted, the opening between them another small door. I knelt without touching them. The cold in the wood came up through my bones. Somewhere behind me, Takoda's breath thickened, not from fear but from recognition. "Not hers," he said. And the words did nothing to ease me, because all at once I knew they were and were not, as if the station kept a shelf where it stored echoes with the care of a clerk who never misfiles. The air smelled faintly of coal that had not burned yet, of iron that had not been struck, and under that a sweetness I could not place until an image rose, a basket of lilacs tipping on a windowsill, water spilling into dust. I reached toward the shoes, stopped the way a horse stops at a snake's shine. The ash from Takoda's work still lined the nails of my right hand, a gray half-moon, and something in me understood that mixing ash with this place was an arithmetic I couldn't solve twice. And then the phrase formed in my head, unbidden, because the platform itself seemed to inhale. At the far end, where the darkness gathered thickest, a breath of steam unfurled as gently as a curtain, and through it I heard the murmur of a crowd that was not there, the old chorus of ticket stubs and farewells and promises men make when time is a straight road in their mouths. A shape moved inside that gauze, not large, not loud, simply present, a vertical smudge against the horizontal insistence of the boards. And even before the steam thinned, I knew the proportions of that outline. The lift of a small head as if listening for a tune only fathers invent. I did not run to her. My body wanted to, my ribs bending around the emptiness like bars around a drum. But Takoda's hand found my sleeve at last, and the pressure of his fingers was all the law I could stand. He shook his head once, and in that small refusal, I read a ledger's worth of warnings. Elowen's voice arrived before her face did, braided of air and echo, pitched higher than the night, but lower than a child's fear. And she said a word that was not mine and was not hers. It slid past my ear and lodged somewhere behind me, as if the station wall had been the intended listener all along. When she stepped into clearer view, the firelight that had marked her was gone, but her eyes held a memory of it, a dull shine at the center like a coal that refuses to die out of spite. She looked not at me but at the rails, tilting her head in that slow, deliberate way I had seen in old mares listening for weather. Her bare feet made no sound on the boards. Her dress did not stir. When the wind dared to move, it moved around her. "Why the shoes?" I asked, because questions sometimes keep a man from breaking. "Why always the shoes?" Takoda's reply was not a comfort. "Because feet remember the path when the mouth forgets the name. Because the station takes what arrives and leaves what cannot leave." He nodded at the twin pair on the boards without shifting his eyes from my daughter. "That is a marker. Not for her. For you." I wanted the meaning and feared it in equal measure. I wanted any simple law, even a cruel one, that would tell me where to place my hands. But the station had its own liturgy, and it was not written in a language the pulpit would claim. Elowen turned at last, and for a breath I thought her face softened, some mercy rising through the glaze to meet me. I whispered her name, not as a summons, but as a shelter, and the boards under my knees creaked like a throat clearing to speak. The rails sang, the faintest, finest note, the kind a man blames on wind until he hears it the second time. And the pale steam thickened again, drawn up from nowhere in slow coils. Takoda's grip tightened. "Do not answer what is not speaking to you," he said, and the edge in his voice carved the air clean. The glow in her eyes brightened, as if responding to a signal laid down years before my birth. She lifted one hand and set it over her heart, then extended the other toward the empty track bed, palm down, the gesture I had seen 100 conductors make, to ask a crowd to hold still while something heavy passed. In that pose, she looked older than the town, older than the rails, a child borrowed by an intention that did not bother with our permission. The unseen train, if that's what the night had decided to call itself, crept into the station with a sound too soft to shake dust, and the pressure of it lay across my shoulders like a bar I had once thought I could carry. Takoda leaned to my ear, each word a nail driven fast and true. "If you choose wrong here, you will call the shadow by your own name." My mouth went dry. I stared at the second pair of shoes, then at the small set of prints already fading like gilt into the planks. Elowen's gaze slid past me, across me, through me, toward the rails where nothing visible moved, and the last of the steam folded itself into her outline as if drawn home. She stepped toward the edge, and I knew that whether the night held a train or only the great hunger of the distance, she meant to board. I rose, not because I had decided, but because a father stands when a door opens on his child. The boards groaned. The rails sang again, a thinner, higher thread. Takoda's hand left my sleeve. "Choose," he said. The word fell between us with the weight of a sentence already written. I took a breath that scraped all the way down, and as I opened my mouth to answer, the station lights, dead all night, fluttered once and caught, bathing the platform in a sickly gold that made every shadow long and every truth near. The station lights burned their thin gold into the fog until even the darkness seemed bleached of courage. And in that sickly glow, my daughter stood, paused at the lip of the rails, as if listening for a promise the earth kept trying not to make. I crouched between the second pair of shoes and the outline of her small body, torn by an instinct older than scripture to take her up and run, but Takoda's hand on my sleeve held me at the last inch, the way a bit pulls a horse from a cliff, and when I turned to tear loose, the fury climbed my throat so fast it blistered. He did not step back. He did not soften. He kept his eyes on Elowen and said, in the tone of a man reading a sentence already signed, that this place would take whatever answer I gave it, and make change from the parts I forgot to count. And if I loved my child, I would not speak until the question had finished asking itself. I hated him for the calm of it, hated him for the space he left between words, and most of all hated him for being right. The rails sang once more, finer, higher, a wire pulled tight, and in the brief shimmer that followed, Elowen's head tilted, not toward me but toward the horizon, as if the night had called her name in a voice I could not hear. Takoda drew me back one step, then another, until the station's thin light framed us without warming. He took the measure of the platform with a glance that understood where old paths ran under the boards, then spoke my name with a care that made me straighten despite myself. He said I stood at the lip of a bargain that would spend me whether I agreed or not, that grief had written a promissory in my mouth the winter my wife died, and tonight the collector had finally found our door. I spat that I would. Pay anything? And he answered that men always say anything before the price is named. The anger broke against the granite of his certainty and fell away in pieces, leaving something worse, the cold understanding that choice and cost had slid together like blades in a sheath. He pointed, 2 fingers, spare and unblessed, at the polished shoes set heel to heel by the post. Markers, he said, not for her alone, for the place, for you. I asked what they meant, and he told me the station keeps proof of arrivals and proof of departures. And when a father calls a child back across the seam, the place puts its own ledger on the table and waits to see whose name will settle the columns. A freighted quiet followed that, heavy enough to bend the boards. Then, with a suddenness that felt like thunder, without sound, Takoda turned on me, not in rage but in demand, the way a surgeon turns when he needs the right instrument or a wound will close wrong forever. He asked if I understood the 2 roads before me, and when I did not answer, he drew them plain across the night. The first, accept the girl as she had returned, shadowed but breathing, and keep her close, learn the thing that walked with her, the way a rancher learns the weather, not to defeat it, but to live without drowning. In that life, I would sleep with one ear turned toward the hallway and one hand on a prayer I did not trust. I would lose and find my child by inches and never know which day was which. The second road, call her back again by stronger means. Force the door to swing until its hinges screamed and make the shadow show its full face. On that path, I might win her entirely, or I might lose her in a way that could not be written down. His voice thinned when he said the second path would tear old grounds and drag other names into the circle, and that the land did not take kindly to being told its work twice. I told him I would choose the path that gave her back without stain, and he looked at me with a sorrow so level it survived the lie. He said there is no path without stain when a man bargains with the threshold. That was when I demanded what right he had to speak, as if he owned this threshold, and the answer arrived so quietly I almost missed the edge of it. He told me he had once knelt on boards, not unlike these. At a stop so far east, the trees wore their leaves like bright coins, and he had asked for his sister with a mouth that had not yet learned patience. The first night he called her, and the wind answered. The second night he called her, and the water answered. The third night he called, and something else answered. A familiar step, a familiar laugh, all of it laid over a face that had learned to look past him. For a season she moved through their house with a stranger in her throat, and he loved her as if the stranger were also theirs. Then the day came when the ground asked for what they had borrowed, and the payment did not stop at her. He did not name the price. He did not need to. His eyes did the arithmetic. The station's fog thinned, exposing the naked line of track beyond, and for a painful breath, I saw Elowen as she had been. Small shoulders, fine wrists, the roundness at her cheeks not yet spent by growth. I told Takoda I would take the first road. I would carry the shadow if it meant she ate at my table and left her cups on my fence post and sang tuneless when she brushed the horses. He shook his head, not in refusal, but as if clearing a vision, and said that choosing is not saying so, but paying so, and payment has a knack for demanding the part of a man that least wants to go. The place has already heard your promise to keep her at any cost, he said. It listens for harmony. It will ask for a note to match. I asked what note. He did not blink. Your years, your land, your name. It will listen for the truth of your willingness, and if your mouth lies, it will take the part of you that told the truth first. I could not tell if that meant my love or my fear. He did not say. A breeze moved through the space under the platform, carrying a whisper that sounded like tires settling, though no train had passed. Takoda's grip left my sleeve and his hands fell to his sides, empty but not unarmed. He warned me the next call from the rails would not be for my ears alone, that the thing standing in my daughter's shape would be invited to choose. If I shouted her name over that call, I might drown out the one piece of her that still knew the road home. If I stayed silent, she might step aboard something that had no destination we could follow. The choice was not between faith and blasphemy, he said. It was between a father's fear and a father's courage. I told him mine were the same animal wearing two coats, and he almost smiled. The first mercy of the night before it vanished. He crouched beside the polished shoes and turned them so that the toes faced one another, closing the small door they had been keeping, then straightened with a finality that made my stomach drop. His voice lost its softness and found iron. The station, he said, had taken the measure of my bargain and marked two names in the ledger, hers and mine. If she crossed back entirely, the shadow would not vanish. It would need a carrier until it found ground of its own. "Understand me, Silas," he said, and the rails chimed a faint agreement that traveled through the boards into my bones. "If you insist on making the door swing wide a second time, the house will name a second body to balance the weight. The shadow will seek a shape close to the first. It will not range far." I looked from the dim shimmer of my daughter's eyes to the reflection of the lamp in the copper rail and felt the world slip 1 inch out of level. My mind reached for loopholes, for clauses, for some kind of annulment that would excuse a man who had prayed wrong at the worst hour of his life. The night offered none. Takoda's lips moved once in a word I could not hear, and the fog folded as if obeying a habit. Then he turned to me and gave the last warning a man can give when he has already told you the truth and still hopes you'll survive hearing it. "Choose the road you can walk without lying to her," he said, and his gaze cut toward the tracks, where the air had begun to thicken in the cold-bellied way it does when something too heavy to see is drawing near. "Because if she returns again, she will not return alone, and the house will reach for you first." The platform shivered. No more than a sigh, the settling of boards. And Elowen's head lifted as if at a signal only she could hear. Her hands rose, palms open to the dark, and somewhere down the line, a lantern winked like the eye of a thing that was not a train and yet had learned to follow the rails. I felt the choice climb my throat, scraping bone, and I understood that speaking would spend me no matter which word I chose. The lights flickered, the rails sang their high, thin note, and the next breath would be the one that named which of us the shadow would learn to wear. The fog did not follow us when Takoda pulled me away from the station. It clung to the platform, as if unwilling to surrender the game it had begun, but the rails still sang in the marrow of my bones long after we turned our backs. We walked until the lamps of town fell behind us, until only the low line of my ranch rose against the horizon, the familiar silhouette of fences and barns etched black against a gray dawn. I had never feared that land before. It had been my labor, my refuge, the one inheritance I could imagine leaving to Elowen. But that morning the sight of it filled me with unease. The house seemed to crouch, not welcome. The fields looked like a sheet drawn over something that had not settled. Takoda's silence grew heavier the nearer we came, until I could no longer keep my own mouth shut. "You speak of debts," I said, voice rough from the night. "But this ground owes me nothing. I carved it from stone. I bled into its soil. My throat closed on the word earned. Even before Takoda shook his head, I knew the correction. "Land remembers more than the man who fences it," he said. "It remembers who lay in it, who was promised to it, who was taken from it too quickly." His eyes cut across the fields to the cottonwoods by the creek, and it remembers every vow spoken in its hearing. His words struck deeper than I wanted to admit, because the ranch carried memories I had buried as carefully as any grave. My wife's death still lived in the walls, in the chair by the hearth, in the room where Elowen had taken her first breath, and Mary had taken her last. I had closed that door and never opened it again, but a house keeps its own keys. Every night since, I had told myself the promise I made in desperation, the one to trade everything for Elowen's life, was a noise tossed to the dark, not a contract. Yet walking through the gate that morning, the boards groaning under our boots, I felt the land shift under me like a ledger recognizing its debtor. Takoda did not follow me to the house, but veered instead toward the slope beyond the barn where the soil changed color, rich where water once pooled. He paused by the old oak, its roots gripping the earth like a hand reluctant to let go. "Here," he said. I frowned. "There's nothing here." He knelt, pressing his palm flat against the ground as he had on the station boards. The air changed, the faintest chill rising from the dirt though the sun was climbing, and my chest tightened. He lifted his hand and told me to dig. When I demanded with what, he handed me the small iron spade from his pouch. It looked too delicate to cut the earth, yet when I drove it into the soil, the ground yielded as if it had been waiting. I dug until sweat ran cold down my back, until my arms ached and the dirt piled in dark clumps beside me. Then the blade struck something softer than stone but firmer than soil. My hands took over, clawing the earth away until a shape emerged. Small, leather, caked in soil, yet unmistakable. A shoe. A woman's shoe. Not Elowen's. Not a child's. A woman's. Its leather warped and stained, dark as dried blood. My vision blurred. The air pressed hard in my ears. Takoda said nothing. He only watched, his face unreadable, as if the earth had told him what we would find before we touched it. My voice cracked when it came. Mary. Her name burned like confession. I remembered the storm the night she died, the way the ground had swallowed the grave too quickly, the way I had told myself the land would keep her safe. But here was proof that promises do not stay buried, that the soil itself refuses silence when bargains are made. I lifted the shoe, the weight of it heavier than any stone I had carried, and Elowen's laughter rang unbidden in my ears. Not the laughter of a child, but the deeper, hollow laugh she had given me at the fire. My knees buckled. I clutched the shoe to my chest and felt the guilt I had damned for years spill over, cold and certain. Takoda's voice cut through. You offered her, whether you knew it or not. In that hour, you placed one life above another. The land heard. It remembers. His words struck like hammer blows, and yet they carried no accusation, only the calm of truth spoken without malice. I wanted to scream that I had no choice, that no man should have to choose between wife and child, but my throat refused. The truth was simpler, harsher. I had chosen, and the land had kept the record. Elowen's survival was not a miracle free of price. It was a balance unsettled, a scale waiting for its counterweight. The wind turned sharp. In the rustle of the oak leaves, I heard a whisper not mine, not Takoda's, a woman's voice, faint but clear, as though carried up from the soil. My chest hollowed. I dropped the shoe, staggered back, and pressed my palms to my ears. But the whisper lingered inside me. Takoda laid a hand on my shoulder, grounding me, though his words chilled me further. Until this balance is met, the shadow will follow her, and it will not stop with her alone. The sun edged over the hills, lighting the ranch with pale gold. The barns, the fences, the fields I had poured myself into, all stood silent, waiting. I looked at the shoe lying in the dirt, at the place where my vows and my failures had bled into the land, and understood that the soil was not done taking. And in that stillness, one question broke me open. Had I saved my daughter's life, or had I condemned her to carry the ghost of the one I sacrificed? The sky came on like a verdict. By noon, the horizon had bruised to a deep iron, and by afternoon the wind had learned our names, combing the grass in hard strokes that raised dust from ground that hadn't been dry an hour before. By the time Takoda led me back to the cottonwoods, the light had gone the color of old coins, and the first low mutter of thunder rolled across the prairie like a wagon loaded with grief. He said storms are doors, the sky opens when the earth refuses to speak, that tonight the weather would tell us what words had failed to finish. And when I asked if he trusted a door you couldn't close, he answered that every birth is that door, and we call it a blessing only because we haven't yet counted the cost. I carried Elowen's shoes in the crook of my arm, the way I had carried her as an infant, aware of the lie and the echo and unable to set it down. The woman's shoe we unearthed at the ranch lay wrapped in cloth at my belt, a weight I could not forget no matter how the wind shoved at my body. He had built a circle there beneath the cottonwoods that hadn't been there the night before, stones fetched from the creek, char black as if they'd been struck by lightning in another county and carried here for this hour. Arc after arc of ash stitched the dirt like careful handwriting, and at the circle's north he had set a narrow trench of water that reflected the sky's yellow bruise as if it were watching us with a sick eye. "This is not a fire to warm us," he said, kneeling to place a bundle of juniper and sage. "It is a fire to name us." The first drops began, fat, slow, insulting, and in the pause between them I could hear the station in my bones. Rails singing from miles away, as if the storm had hooked itself to that metal and was drawing a line between there and here. I asked if the station would answer what we did tonight. "It already has," he said. "Your feet returned to this ground." When the storm found its voice, it did not bother with preamble. Lightning split the sky from cloud to creek with a crack that made my teeth jump. The cottonwoods shivered like animals that would run if they had legs to spare. Takoda's drum, which had sounded handmade and human under the station lights, deepened until it seemed the sky was beating it with both hands. The fire took on the shape of the wind, not fighting it but bowing with it, and the smoke rose in a tight column as if the rain could not wet it. Up through the branches, into the bruised light, a spine the storm couldn't break. "Set them," he said, and I understood. Elowen's shoes, at the circle's southern edge, heel to heel, toes parted. The woman's shoe, Mary's, at the west, toe pointed inward. A space left empty at the east, where he said the shadow waited when it was ready to learn a face. The thunder moved closer, not marching but circling, and when it spoke directly above us, the ground answered with a tremor that I felt through my hands and into my wrists. Takoda's voice slid under the drum in the old tongue, and for the first time since this began, I heard something like pleading in him, which frightened me more than his certainty ever had. He dusted each shoe with ash, touched the copper wire to his thumb, and bled a neat, unwilling drop, then pulled a coal from the fire with tongs and set it on the wet dirt to hiss and spit. "You promised her life for your loss," he said without looking up. "Tonight you promise your loss. Name it." The wind lifted the word loss and brought it back heavier. I opened my mouth, and the truth found it, because lying to a storm is how men die. I named my years if they were asked for. I named my land if it would balance the ledger. I named my pride, though it howled at being called. And then without meaning to, I named the fear I had been hiding. The fear that if Elowen came back clean, the house would feel her absence from the shadow like a limb cut twice. Lightning struck the ridge and left the air tasting of metal, and in the white aftershock I saw her, the outline of my daughter at the eastern gap, hair lifted by wind that did not touch me, the dress clinging to her like a remembered river. She did not blink at the light. She looked only at the circle. She stepped forward and the rain gave her room, beating on her skin as if undecided. I whispered her name, not loud, not to claim, only to keep its warmth in the world, and she turned her head the way she had always done when I said it, in that soft, private tone I wasn't sure other fathers used. But the eyes that met mine had storm in them, pale, bright, busy with a work I could not see. She spoke then. A syllable I had heard at the station, a piece of a language that borrowed breath from any mouth near enough to be taxed. The fire leaned toward her like a dog to its first owner. The drum found a cadence that told the storm we were not prey. Takoda's hand sliced the air between us. "Do not cross," he said. "If you enter now, the door will choose you." He set the feather on Elowen's shoes, and the copper wire shone like a vein catching sunlight at the bottom of a well. The water trench at north wrinkled under fat drops, as if something beneath it had rolled over to watch. You called her once, he said. The place answered twice. Tonight you will either tie her to the earth you claimed, or you will tear the cloth and the wind will wear what's loose. He looked older than the trees. If I pull her clean, the shadow will find a carrier. Doors do not swing without hinges. Thunder unrolled like canvas. Rain came down, not in threads, but in ropes. The smoke column held. Elowen shuddered where she stood, and the shudder ran through me as if a wire linked our spines. A keening rose, child and not child, woman and not woman, a braid of sound that made the horses in my barn, a mile away, throw their heads and snap halter rings against wood. I thought of Mary's shoe in the west, toe pointed toward this work, and I thought of the second pair at the station with their clean, unspent leather, and I understood that the storm was counting and that my name was on its fingers. Takoda, I said, and the wind nearly stole it. If there must be a carrier, let it be me. The words cost me something I had saved for last. He did not thank me. He did not praise me. He only nodded like a man setting a crossbeam, and the nod was an answer the storm could hear. Then know the shape of that weight, he said, and he turned the drum until its voice struck my chest at an angle that found marrow. He poured ash into the trench, gray bleeding into brown, and the water went still, a mirror even under rain. Put your right hand in the circle, palm up. I knelt. The mud was cold as forgiveness. My hand shook and steadied. Call her, he said. Not like a man calling a child out of a river, like a man calling himself into one. I said her name and felt the door move. I said it again and it moved more. The feather rose from the laces without my breath to lift it. The copper woke. The woman's shoe darkened, leaching old stain into new rain, and a thin line of red wrote itself between west and south as if ink had found a paper it preferred. The sky tore. Light stepped down into the circle and walked from stone to stone, choosing. Elowen cried out, and this time it was her voice, high, frightened, brave the way only children are, and I made the mistake all fathers make when the world shows its teeth. I reached. My fingers crossed the ash by an inch. The storm hit like a thrown door. Heat met cold. The air knocked flat. The fire burned blue for a breath, and everything I was, in years, in land, in name, stood naked inside the circle with no coat to hide beneath. I felt a hand in mine, and it was hers and it was not. Small bones and a strength that did not belong to a child. Behind that grip, something older wrapped my wrist like a second pulse learning to keep time. Hold! Takoda shouted, and the words sounded like iron in water. If you let go now, she will follow the loudest name. My fingers locked because they had no other work left to do. The storm's voice narrowed to a spear. The drum struck a final pattern and stopped mid-beat, leaving the night hanging, and in that sudden absence, a small sound found room to exist. The catch of breath a newborn makes after the world has decided for it. It came from the ground, from the fire, from the thin line of red, from the hand curling tighter in mine, everywhere at once. Then the light went out as if a vast palm had closed. Silence climbed the trees, ran the creek bed dry, and settled on my tongue like ash. For a moment, I could not tell if the storm had ended, or if it had drawn itself so close I was inside its quiet. I looked down at the circle for the first truth I could bear, and all I could see was her small body, unmoving, the feather resting against her chest like a black leaf that had found its season. By the time we reached the cottonwoods again, the sky had already turned the color of iron. Clouds folded over each other like black sails, the air heavy with a taste of metal, and the prairie seemed to crouch low, waiting. The storm did not creep. It advanced with the sound of a verdict, each gust bending the grass in, long sweeps that hissed like warnings. I had weathered countless tempests on my ranch, storms that ripped shingles from the roof and sent cattle scattering, but this one carried a different charge. It was not simply water and wind gathering. It was a door being pushed open from the other side, Takoda walked ahead without slowing, the braids on his shoulders snapping like whips in the wind. "The storm remembers," he said, almost to himself, "and tonight it will speak louder than either of us." The circle he had built beneath the cottonwoods waited, black stones arranged with a mason's care, lines of ash inscribed across the dirt like letters I could not read. At its northern edge lay a shallow trench of water, rippling with the reflection of the bruised sky. At the south, Takoda motioned for me to place Elowen's shoes. Heel to heel, toes parted like a door left ajar. To the west he laid the woman's shoe we had unearthed at the ranch. The sight of it in the circle twisted my stomach. The shoe Mary had worn on the day she gave her life for Elowen's first breath, now set as if to testify. At the east, he left a gap, empty, waiting. "That is where the shadow stands," he said. The first drops fell, fat, warm, striking the ground like thrown stones. Lightning tore the horizon open, and thunder followed so fast it felt less like sound than the earth itself breaking. Takoda began to drum. The low beat at first matched the storm, then cut across it, insisting on its own rhythm. His chant rose, syllables carrying the weight of something older than this sky. Smoke climbed from the fire in the circle's heart, impossibly straight despite the wind tearing through the branches. "Name your loss," Takoda said between chants, his eyes on me. "The storm waits for what you promised." I tried to resist, but lying to the sky is like spitting into the tide. The words tumbled out. I offered my years if they were asked for, my land if it was demanded, even my name if it would balance the scales. But deeper still, the truth surfaced unbidden. I feared not only losing Elowen, but also keeping her when the shadow inside her was hungrier than I could ever be strong. My confession vanished into the wind, carried upward as if the storm itself had leaned close to listen. The thunder cracked like a cannon, and in the white glare that followed I saw her. Elowen stood at the eastern edge of the circle, her small frame outlined against the storm. Her hair lifted, though no wind touched me. Her dress clung to her skin as if soaked in a river that had not yet fallen. My heart lurched. She was here. She was mine. But when she turned her face toward me, the eyes that met mine were stormlit, pale and bright, busy with work that was not hers. She opened her mouth, and the words that spilled out were not words a child could know. The fire bent toward her as if recognizing an elder. I staggered forward, but Takoda slashed the air with his hand. "Do not cross," he barked. "If you enter, the door will name you." His drumbeat quickened, rising to a rhythm that cut through the thunder. He laid the black feather across Elowen's shoes, and the copper wire binding them sparked like a vein filled with lightning. The trench of water shivered and then went still, a mirror under rain. My daughter's lips shaped my name, not father, but Silas, spoken with an accent I did not know. The storm pressed harder. Rain poured in sheets, yet the smoke column held fast, climbing upward like a spine. Elowen swayed as if tethered to the storm itself, her small hands lifting, her voice layering into the thunder until it became impossible to tell whether the storm was echoing her or she was echoing it. The cry that followed hollowed me out. It was hers, yet not hers, a braid of voices, young and old, male and female, stacked through centuries. The sound made the cottonwoods tremble and sent the horses in my barn shrieking against their halters. I could not bear it. "Take me," I shouted, my voice ragged against the wind. "If a carrier is needed, let it be me. Leave her." Takoda's eyes flashed. He did not smile, nor soften, but his nod told me the storm had heard. "Then know the weight of your vow," he said, his voice like iron splitting wood. "Once spoken, it cannot be gathered back." He poured ash into the trench, the water swallowing it until its surface turned black. "Place your hand in the circle," he commanded. "Palm up." My body shook, but I obeyed. The mud gripped my wrist, cold as stone. "Call her," he said. Not like a man calling a child out of a river, but like a man willing to drown in her place. I said her name once. The fire flared. I said it again. The feather lifted from the shoes without wind. The copper glowed. The woman's shoe darkened until the stain spread new and wet. A thin line of red bled between west and south, as if the storm had written in ink across the dirt. Lightning speared the ground, and the circle erupted in light, so fierce I could see nothing but her outline. Her hand reached toward mine. I grabbed it, and in that instant, I knew it was Elowen's hand, and not hers. Her fingers small, but the grip ancient, stronger than bone should bear. The storm drove itself into the circle, and the drumbeat stopped on a single note, leaving us suspended in silence, thick as stone. Then I heard it, the sound every father waits for, the fragile catch of breath after a child's cry. It came from the circle, from the fire, from the shadow that pressed against my wrist. I looked down, heart breaking with hope. Elowen lay before me, her small chest rising once, her face slack with exhaustion. The feather rested against her chest like a black leaf. And then the storm went still. The silence that followed was worse than thunder. It pressed against my ears, against my throat, against my ribs. I wanted to believe it was over, that she had returned, that the storm had paid itself. But Takoda's face, sharp in the dying glow, told me otherwise. His eyes carried no relief, only warning. When the storm broke, it did not scatter west into the hills, as most tempests did. It folded itself inward, collapsing with a sound like canvas tearing, and left behind a quiet so deep it startled my lungs into shallow gasps. The cottonwoods stood dripping in the silver light of dawn, their leaves heavy with water, yet no wind shook them. The world seemed pinned, as though nailed down by the silence itself. My ears rang in the absence of thunder, every beat of my heart louder than the sky had been. The fire had collapsed to blackened stones, the smoke gone, as if swallowed by the air, and at the circle's center lay Elowen, her chest rising faintly beneath the feather that had drifted down to rest over her heart. I crawled toward her, mud slick on my knees, and gathered her into my arms. Her skin burned with the heat of fever, yet her body was limp, too light, as though the storm had stripped her of weight. "Elowen," I whispered, shaking, afraid that if I spoke louder, the silence would punish me. Her eyelids fluttered. A soft moan escaped her lips, weak but human, achingly human, and tears filled my eyes until her face blurred. For the first time in nights, I believed, truly believed, she was back. But then her lips moved again, shaping a word I could not understand. A word not meant for me, spoken in a tongue too old for any father to claim. My relief curdled. Takoda crouched across the circle, his own chest heaving as though the storm had been drawn through him. He did not rush to comfort, did not cross the ash lines, still marking the dirt, but studied her with eyes that reflected no triumph. "She breathes," he said, "but not alone." His words cut through me like cold water. "What do you mean?" I demanded, clutching her tighter. "You told me." "I told you the door does not swing for one traveler," he interrupted, his voice steady despite his weariness. "The storm chose her, but it chose something else as well. You felt it in your hand." I remembered the strength in her grip, far greater than any child's, and shivered. I had told myself it was the storm's force, but the truth now pressed harder. I had held not just my daughter, but the shadow riding her. The sun crept over the horizon, thin and pale, more like a lantern than a lord of the sky. Its light touched the fields around us, revealing the storm's ruin. Branches stripped bare, fences scattered like bones, the creek swollen and angry. Yet within the circle the earth lay untouched, the ash lines still unbroken, as though the storm had never dared step inside. Takoda traced a finger through the mud, quiet for a long time. Finally he spoke. "The silence you hear now is not peace. It is debt unspoken. The land waits." His words sent a shiver through me more than any thunder had. I looked down at Elowen in my arms, her breath shallow, her skin hot, and wondered if the quiet pressing against my ears was not silence at all but listening. We carried her back to the ranch, though carried is not the right word. She seemed to drift between us, her head rolling lightly against my shoulder, her breath a frail thread that might snap at any moment. The house loomed ahead, the same walls I had built, the same roof I had mended, yet its shape in the dawn unsettled me. It no longer looked like a refuge, but like a witness waiting to testify. Inside, the rooms smelled of damp wood and smoke, familiar yet hostile. I laid her on her narrow bed, tucking the blanket around her small frame, my hands trembling at how little space she seemed to fill. For a moment, she was only my child again, fragile from fever, needing a father's care. I clung to that illusion until Takoda's voice broke it. "You must prepare," he said. He stood in the doorway, framed by the light of morning, his silhouette long and heavy. "This is not over. The shadow will not rest in her quietly. It will speak. It will move. And when it does, you must be ready to answer." I shook my head, rage flaring through my grief. Answer how? With prayers that go unanswered? With rituals that tear her apart? She is just a girl, my voice cracked. She is my girl. Takoda stepped closer, lowering his voice. And because she is yours, the shadow chose her. Do not think of it as punishment. Think of it as inheritance. The word cut me to the bone. Inheritance. I thought of the ranch, the land, the cattle, the fences stretching across soil that had already claimed too much from me. I had imagined leaving all of it to Elowen one day, the fruit of my years, the proof of my work. But Takoda was right. The land itself was the inheritance, and it carried debts heavier than any ledger I could close. Now my daughter bore them in her body. I dropped to the chair beside her bed, my head in my hands, choking on the silence that thickened the air. It pressed against my chest, against my ears, against my soul, until I could no longer tell if I was grieving her or grieving myself. Then, a sound. Small, sharp, deliberate. I lifted my head. Elowen's eyes were open. They fixed on me, not with the dazed blur of fever, but with clarity that chilled me. She spoke my name, not father, not papa. Silas. My breath caught. Her voice carried an accent that was not hers, a cadence that bent the syllables into something older, something learned long before her birth. She blinked once, slowly, and when her lips parted again, the voice that came was not a child's at all. Takoda's shadow fell across us. He spoke softly, almost with pity. "The dawn of silence has come. It is waiting for you to answer." And in that moment, I realized the storm had not ended. It had only changed shape. The thunder was gone, but the silence was louder, pressing, demanding. And Elowen's body was now the vessel in which it would speak. The morning light spilled across the ranch like a blade dulled by too many sharpenings, its glow pale and thin, painting everything in tired gold. The storm had gone, yet its silence lingered, thick as tar, pressed into the wood of the house, into the earth, under my boots, into my very breath. I sat at Elowen's bedside, her small frame cocooned in blankets, her skin fever hot, her lips moving restlessly even in sleep. At times, a whisper slid from her mouth, syllables that belonged to no language I knew, syllables that seemed to curl against the air and wait, as though listening for an answer. Takoda stood in the doorway, his shoulders filling the frame, his face shadowed by a weight I could not name. He had not spoken much since the storm ended, yet his silence was no relief. It carried more judgment than any preacher's sermon. At last his voice came low, patient, almost mournful. "The storm has named its price. Now the land waits for yours." I bristled. "I have given everything. My years, my land, my name. I offered myself to carry the shadow." "You offered," Takoda said, stepping inside, his boots heavy on the floorboards. "But the offering must be accepted, and it has not yet chosen. Tonight the shadow will decide. If you are ready, it may pass to you. If you falter, it will stay in her." And then he trailed off, his eyes sliding toward my daughter, the weight of unfinished words suffocating the air between us. I stared at her, my hands gripping the chair arms until the wood creaked. Her breath came shallow but steady. Her face, softened in sleep, was still hers, still my child's. Yet even as I watched, her lips moved again, whispering a name that was not mine, not hers, Not anyone's. The sound crawled across the walls like a nail scratching would. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as ash. What happens if it stays in her? I asked. Takoda's eyes darkened. Then you will lose her slowly, piece by piece. She will breathe, she will eat, she may even laugh. But it will not be her laughter. And one day, when you call her, the shadow will answer instead. The words struck like iron. I bent over her bed, brushing damp hair from her forehead, my chest breaking under the weight of love and fear. I could not imagine a world where my daughter lived, but did not belong to herself. I would rather bury her a second time than watch her fade into something unrecognizable. Yet the thought of surrendering her to silence forever twisted like a knife in me. Takoda set a small bundle on the table. Red thread, a bowl blackened by fire, and the black feather that had carried through every step of this ordeal. Tonight we bargain one last time, he said. The final circle, the last door. If you stand, she may walk free. If you fail, she will not walk alone. Night fell heavy, clouds torn but not broken, the horizon stitched in dull red, as though the storm had bled into the sky. We carried her once more to the cottonwoods, the circle remade in, fresh ash. The stones gleamed wet, the earth dark with memory. I laid her shoes at the south, Mary's at the west, the gap left open at the east. Takoda lit the fire, its flames rising in strange colors, blue, green, flashes of white that stabbed at the eye. The feather he set across the laces, the copper catching firelight like blood turned to metal. He began the chant. The drum followed, a slow rhythm at first, then faster, as though urging the very earth to wake. I knelt beside Elowen where she lay inside the circle, her hands folded on her chest. At first she seemed only to sleep. Then her body shuddered, her back arched, a cry tore from her throat, high, sharp, layered with voices. Her eyes flew open, glowing pale as stormlight, and she sat up with emotion too strong for her frail frame. "Silas," she said. "Not Papa, not Father. Silas!" The voice was not hers. I trembled. "Elowen, I'm here." Her lips curved into a half smile, but the expression was too old, too knowing. "She is here," the voice said, "but she does not walk alone." I looked at Takoda, desperation clawing my chest. "What do I do?" He did not stop drumming. His chant rose higher, his eyes locked on mine. "Give it your name, bind it to you, but do not falter. If you falter, it will stay with her forever." I turned back to my daughter, to the stranger in her skin. My mouth was dry, my chest tight, but I forced the words out. "Come to me, I take you, leave her." The air thickened, the fire bent toward me, its flames leaning like hands reaching. The shadow's voice hissed through her lips. "Do you know what you ask? You will not live long. You will not die clean. You will carry me until the earth calls you under. Do you still ask?" "Yes," I said, my voice breaking but certain. "Take me. Leave her." The ground shuddered. The fire snapped. The feather lifted into the air, spinning, pointing between us. Elowen's eyes widened, not with shadow, but with terror. Her small voice broke through for the first time in days. "Papa!" My chest cracked wide at the sound. I lunged forward, my hand outstretched. She reached back, her small fingers trembling. Our hands touched. The heat was unbearable, a current tearing through me, burning, hollowing. My vision blurred. I saw Mary's face in the flames, smiling, then fading. I saw the station, its platform waiting, its second pair of shoes gleaming in shadow. I heard the rails sing. Then all was silent. I collapsed backward out of the circle, choking, gasping, the taste of iron in my mouth. Elowen lay inside, her eyes closed, her chest rising steady and clean. She was free. I knew it. I felt it. The shadow had left her. But as the fire dimmed, I felt something else stir in me, a weight pressing down, a voice curling in my chest that was not mine. Takoda's gaze fell on me, sorrow heavy in his face. "It has chosen," he said, and in the silence that followed, I realized the truth. I had won my daughter's life, but the shadow now walked in me. I leave you with this question. Would you have done the same if this story held you to the end? If you felt the storm and the silence with me, then like this video, share it, and subscribe to the channel. More stories wait in the dark, and the next door is already opening.